What's up, everyone? Elmi here, and since it is October, I thought I would start getting into some horror movie reviews, and I figured what better way to start it off than to start it off with a review with my good friend Nick Mulae. And for this review, we both wanted to take a look into something that we find very underrated, and it is the 1988 remake of The Blob. So, The Blob was originally a 1958 classic with Steve McQueen, and it is a pretty cherished cult classic, but they just figured, but then during the 80s, they figured they could just make a better version with updated effects, and, I gotta say, they were pretty right, don't you think?
Absolutely, and considering this was pretty much right around the time, considering that this was the 1980s, this is when we started seeing, remakes coming out of different types of classic movies. I mean, of course, there were remakes prior to the 80s, too. Yeah. But I think the 80s, in particular, especially after when the slasher craze started ending, is when the remakes kind of started up. Oh, so yes. We're talking probably mid to late 80s.
Yeah, because there were tons of good examples of as far as 80s horror remakes, such as The Fly and The Thing. Yeah, like The Thing is one of my favorites, definitely.
That's definitely one of the best all-time remakes, in my opinion. It's a great movie.
But not all remakes have had a good theatrical release, and this was one that did not, because it made probably just under its budget. So it was a box office failure, but The Blob has received a good cult following over the years, and when you see the film, you're going to see why. I mean, it has a lot of great actors in it. It has Shawnee Smith, who would later on play Amanda in the Saw movies. And I believe she also had a part in the miniseries for Stephen King's The Stand.
That's correct,
I believe she did, yes. And also starred Kevin Dillon. And I remember him from Platoon. He did a really good job playing a minor villain in that. And I believe he's the brother of Matt Dillon, actor. Yeah,
I believe so. But also, Dad, as I remember, he also made an appearance on in the mid-90s of episode of Tales from the Crypt.
Yes, Tales from the Crypt. He started an episode with Will Wheaton, I believe. It was House of Horror.
That's correct.
The Frat brothers go to the haunted house.
That's it is a creepy, but at the same time a very silly and somewhat funny episode.
It is.
I really enjoy. That's probably one of my favorite season 5 episodes.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They've had a lot of good people working on creating this film as well. This was directed by Chuck Russell, who he directed the Jim Carrey film The Mask. Yeah, so he directed and wrote this film alongside with Frank Darabont, who, if that name sounds familiar, he was the director of several Stephen King films, such as The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist, and also is one of the creators for the AMC series The Walking Dead.
Affirmative. I think he's still working on the series to this day, and I just actually recently found out that they're making another spin-off series, speaking of which.
Oh, man.
Yep.
Yes. Cannot wait for that. What did you like best about it?
Well, what I liked about it in particular is that, although I'm not crazy about it today, it was definitely one of the first films where CGI was pretty much introduced into it, although, of course, I'm more of the old-fashioned kind of person with costume as special effects, animation, or claymation, or stop motion, if you will. But I think it was also kind of like, in some way, trying to bring back memory. Like in this case with the original Blob that came out back in 1958, so, 30 years before then, I guess it was a kind of somewhat bring back memories of like how the original one, kind of sparked popularity. But I think also to kind of somewhat, perhaps, basically show what would happen if it occurred in the then modern world, 1988.
Yep, very true. And when they originally made The Blob, it was sort of like a message people had during the Cold War, where there was high tension between Americans and the Russians, and where they feel like the Russians were trying to take everything over, like assimilate everything, people losing their individuality, becoming part of something. Well, that's kind of what The Blob represented. It represented this thing that assimilates and just grows uncontrollably. And you ever heard of the term Red Menace?
Yeah, I've heard of
which is
Red
what they
Menace.
used to describe the Russians. Well, the Blob was a red menace.
Indeed. Yeah, it's like this kind of small gelatinous, almost basically like a giant amoeba almost, and it's amazing how small it starts at the beginning, and then it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it continues to assimilate its victims.
Oh yes. It gets bigger to the point where it just becomes uncontrollable, unstoppable. Like, people have tried all sorts of things, like shooting it or burning it. And I believe in the beginning of the original, they threw like a bottle of acid at it and had no effect.
Doctor, nothing will stop it.
See, it's like this blob. It's like a jellyfish. It's got no heart, no brain, no eyes, no mouth. It does have somewhat of emotions because we see it does get aggravated at times.
Yeah.
So, the whole point of what I'm getting to is that all the things I mentioned that it doesn't have, in other words, there's really no weak spot to it.
It hardly has any. It has almost no weaknesses at all. And so what I was most impressed by, as far as this remake, was especially the effects that went into it, the practical stuff. But primarily with the practical effects, the puppeteering, everything, like the way it depicts the Blob, the way it absorbs people, and just its appearance overall, which I think was a major. Which I think was a major improvement compared to the original, because when you think back to the original film, the Blob, it just had a very simple effect. It just looked like like a gelatin, it's just the sort of thing that would not adapt very well to 80s cinema or much less modern cinema. Because, I remember first showing my cousin they went years back. I showed my cousin the original version of the Blob, and he's just like, "What's so scary about Killer Jello?"
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those. I think if you look at both films, especially like the original one, where movies like that could make something that looks almost impossible for it to be a complete threat to society, whether it's just in movies or in the real world. But I guess in the cinema aspect, it looks like something that's almost impossible to call it dangerous until it's too late. So, filmmakers really know how to bring these things to life and just make them basically deadly killing machines.
That they did. This Blob was depicted as a much more deadly enemy. It is secreted with this corrosive fluids, as it was depicted in the opening scenes, where Paul was attacked, when it was overhead, and you see this liquid dripping down and burning holes through the desk like an acid.
Right, it's like an acidic fluid it has within it.
Oh yeah, and that scene right there makes you realize nobody is safe, because this was the boyfriend on their very first date. They were the ones who found the old man, brought him to the hospital, so you think, oh, he's going to be the hero in this film, but nope. Yeah, nope. And I just love, and just everything that went into that scene, the effects, when it showed the Blob, moving his way towards the window with Paul inside of him, and he's all covered except for his I believe it was his right arm.
Yeah, I think it was his right arm.
And is grabbing his arm, trying to pull him off, but then it ends up pulling his arm off.
I have to admit, that scene was awesome.
Yeah, it's also because of the work. You could just tell these effects, a lot of good work went into them.
Oh yeah, I mean, just imagine how much of the work that they had to put into those effects. I mean, you could tell it may have been easy to shoot those scenes, but actually creating them, oh my God, sometimes they could take weeks, if not for months.
Yeah, it's filming the scenes is one thing, but creating the monsters in the scenes, that's another thing entirely. Yeah, whether you're using practical effects or CGI, there's just a ton of effort that needs to go into it.
I mean, obviously, I will admit, the Blob in this case obviously was not as difficult compared to other giant monster movies like the Godzilla series, because those require much more work to put in. But even just making something that's just supposed to be human size, and especially if it's featureless in the way how it's supposed to move, that's still extremely difficult to take. Just because you have a project involved that's involving a smaller human-sized monster, or maybe taller than average, that's still going to be very, very difficult to create.
Oh yes, for sure. And another addition to the Blob that I like is that unlike the original, the Blob now has these tentacles that when it gets big to the certain point, when that scene where they're at the diner and after the Blob sucks the guy down the sink, which is Yeah, believe me, that's something that has to be seen to be believed. But and then emerges from this thing. He starts emitting tentacles, which he uses to grab its victims. And I gotta say that actually was a nice touch.
That definitely was, because in the original one, it was basically just kind of again, unlike the remake, where it just kind of moved almost, basically just absorbing whatever was in its path.
Whatever was able to touch.
Whatever it was able to touch.
Yeah.
But in this one, it had a consciousness, so you could clearly tell it was visibly aware of what it was doing. Mm-hmm. And in this case, for it to pull down someone into the sink, which is highly impossible in real life, unless you crunch them up so tough, that tough. But seeing tentacles come out, that clearly shows it has some type of intelligence to it.
That's true.
So it doesn't, unlike the original one, it doesn't. In the original one, in other words, it didn't care what it absorbed, but in this one, it clearly knew what it was looking for.
It had determination,
intention.
Yeah, and and also I should mention that scene, where as it was sucking the guy down the pipe kind of bent, outward, like without even breaking, which I'm sure that's not how pipes work.
Nope, that wouldn't be. Even if you got the strongest type, that would still, even if they claim that they're unbreakable, they're going to break.
It bulged down. That's what I'm looking for. That's which, no, that would not happen.
Impossible.
Yeah. And another example of how they show you that nobody's safe, I think back to where, this makes me think of how some horror films back in the 80s and 70s, how they don't screw around. One of the boys ends up getting eaten by the blob, and then it shows him popping up partially devoured, his face all melted up. When I saw that, I was in total shock.
Yeah. It's often kind of rare to see. It seems like it's becoming more common nowadays, but back in those days, it was often rare to see kids usually getting killed in films. Unless it's supposed to be some type of, I don't know, a more sillier film. When it comes to serious movies, you don't really see kids getting killed very often. And the times when they call them kids, it's usually people in their 20s for the most part. In this rare case, they're using an actual kid instead.
Actual children. That kid looked like he was probably, 11, maybe 12 years old?
11, 12 years old, somewhere around there, preteens.
Oh yeah, for sure. It is not the first film to ever do this, to have a kid being killed. We've seen several examples, like Jaws, one of the biggest ones, but it doesn't make it any less shocking, though. Yeah,
there's been a few other ones that have been made in between, even not just in the 70s and 80s, but even going back earlier, as far as I know, going back to the 30s.
Yeah, and overall, I just like this the story of it, and how they actually gave the blob an origin. How in the original, the blob just came in from a meteor, an alien from space, nobody has any idea where it came from exactly. But as we find out later on, the blob, when the military, these scientists come into the picture and try to quarantine the whole town, they spread this story that, it's a viral outbreak or something or other. But really, the blob was actually man-made, created by them as a bioweapon for the Cold War. And that meteor he came in wasn't a meteor at all. It was actually a satellite that was used to contain this thing after it became out of control.
Indeed. So it's amazing how sometimes they try to, even if they're covering it up, how this thing appears like it's of extraterrestrial origin, only for it to come back, and then you realize that, wait a second, if you find out the true story about it, and you realize this was actually man-made, it kind of almost makes you want a second thought. Could there be living creatures out there, or out in space, or did we create these creatures ourselves? Because you have to remember, all the time we always hear we're basically the most destructive species in the universe.
No doubt. I just love the way they also depicted the movie theater scene, because in the original, we only just saw the blob just emerging from the projection room after it took out the guy working in there, and then just people running out of there, and the blob coming out even bigger than ever, implying that he absorbed so many people in there. But now in this version, we get to see the actual carnage, the actual people getting sucked in, people having half their bodies devoured. It showed that one part where Johnny Smith sees a girl on the ground, tries to pull her up, and ends up like she was already halfway dissolved.
Yeah, this time you saw actual carnage. To this thing, it was basically like an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just, again, it's one of those type of scenarios where in some of these older horror films, like the original Blob, or you look at other movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you never saw really the impact occurring on people. It usually happened behind closed doors or in the shadows, or they cut that. I mean, they never had the intention of showing it. Nowadays, we want to see. Yeah. This was basically the start where we wanted to see what actually would happen to somebody, like the worst things. Because before, your mind pretty much told you what could happen, but you never really could quite guess it. So I guess in this case, we want to see it so we could see exactly, what's the worst can possibly happen to someone, the worst way to die.
Yep. We actually want to see violence. We actually want to see carnage. Man, we have become very sick.
Yes, we have indeed. If I could trade places with people from those eras, I definitely would.
I personally believe that this version of the Blob is better than the original, as far with all the advancements that it had, as far as the filmmaking and with the effects, and just people who were working behind the scenes.
Yeah. See, I mean, truth be told, I'm not a huge fan of remakes, but I do have my exceptions, and I would say definitely the remake of The Blob is definitely one of the couple best remakes out there since John Carpenter's The Thing.
Oh, yes. I love how, when we're close to the end, how when they realize the Blob's weakness is cold, it shows the reason why it just didn't go after them while they were stuck in the freezer. Like in the original film, they were in the freezer and it just moved away after getting inside just slightly, just backing up.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Blob hates the cold. And so everybody started using CO2 on it in the remake, but just like they did in the original, because that's how they stopped it in the first one.
I don't think it can be killed, but at least we've got it stopped.
But it slowed it down, but it didn't stop it. It's like, this Blob is deadlier, it really means business, like you need something bigger to stop it. And so liquid nitrogen, that's when that comes in.
Perhaps, I mean, that's like the last hope, because other than that, if something like that really did happen in real life, you probably would hear me say, I don't think we could ever truly win. I think we could just slow it down. And that's unfortunately kind of the case with a lot of cases, with like such diseases and stuff like that, is the best thing we can do for the most part is just by slowing it down.
Exactly. And so, I will say this though, I do like the effect that they use for the Blob in the end when it's like flash frozen by liquid nitrogen, because a lot of people are wondering how they managed to create like a crystallized frozen Blob, and very simple. It's just a pile of rock salt that they painted this pink, this purple color.
Yeah, they almost look like crystals almost. It actually is quite beautiful almost. I mean, it looks like, I'm actually surprised. Wouldn't it be funny if all the female survivors out there used it as jewelry?
Yeah, it looks beautiful at first, but once heated up...
No, that's it. That's it for you. Your goose is cooked.
Oh yeah. Speaking of heated up, I remember the Reverend in the end. He just saw the Blob as like this force, this apocalyptic force portrayed by the Bibles. I would like to know where in the Bible it exactly says that a Blob would destroy all mankind. Like that's the cause of the apocalypse. Yeah, doubt that. And how some of the crystals that he had picked up from like the freezer and put it in a jar, it shows in the end he had it and it was thought out. He had the intention to release it when the Lord gave him a sign, which implied there would be a sequel, but that sequel never happened.
Yeah, as in the case of a lot of remakes, we don't always see a lot of sequels come out, because I think a lot of filmmakers know out there that the remake is probably as best as they will go, because, if they create a sequel, it's usually not going to be good. There are very few remakes out there that have successful sequels. So I think one film is definitely enough.
But, The Blob, definitely a film worth seeing. It's very rare that I consider a remake to be as good, if not better, than the original. And I think The Blob is a prime example of that. So I'm giving The Blob a 7 out of 10. So what would be your rating?
I probably would give a 7 out of 10 as well. I mean, once again, I don't do that very often for remakes, but once again, I'll make this an exception.
Sounds good. So that's it. That's it for this review. Hope you guys enjoyed. And Nick, thanks so much for being a part of this review.
My pleasure. I always enjoy being on these movie reviews with you. So I'm always having a lot of fun with these. So I'm always open for these.
Oh yeah, we definitely got to do more of these.
Yeah, we should try to do one right before Halloween.
Yes,
it's just a couple weeks away.
Agreed. right, so hope you guys enjoyed, and happy Halloween. Bye.
Bye.
Beware of the blob, it creeps and leaps and glides and slides across the floor, right through the door and all around the wall. A splotch, be careful of the blob.